Hi, Angela Wolf here, owner of Angela Wolf Patterns and Online Academy. And today we are on location again in my studio with all the travel restrictions. So welcome. And today I'm going to show you how to take that Bella top and add a silk chiffon sleeve. Silk chiffon can be tricky to work with, and we're also going to have a French seam with the sleeve and a regular seam for the garment. So let me show you a few tricks for working with silk chiffon. So here I have just a piece of silk chiffon and I have this laid out. You could use a rotary cutter for this, but if your blade is not just right on spot sharp, you can cut this with the rotary cutter and you can end up with little splinters, which can cause your fabric to fray. So instead, I usually will lay my pattern out, and these are just some pattern weights on there, and I'm using serrated scissors. And serrated scissors will capture that fabric as you go around. And again, I cut just outside of my pattern. Similar to how I do the mesh, right? Just a little bit. Because this fabric is so slippery, if you give yourself just a little bit of extra room, it's much easier to get around. So you'll cut out your pattern, and you can see that serrated edge, it just captures the fabric instead of moving it. All right, again, give yourself a snip at the top where your shoulder is, each of your notches, and of course I'll clean that up a little bit, but I'm at the wrong angle to do that here. So cut out your sleeve, and you'll cut 2 of these out, of course, unless you're only sewing 1. And here I have my sleeve sewn into one side. So you're going to sew your sleeve the exact same way we did with the mesh, where you sew your sleeve. I used pink thread again so you can see this. Press the seam allowance toward the garment so you can't see it. And then you have the option of doing some top stitching. I just left that for now because we're going to really focus on the sleeves. So the first thing you need to do is we're going to sew a French seam just for the sleeve part. All right? So the first, I didn't really think you needed to see this part, but you can see my thread. With wrong sides together, from your seam at your underarm seam to the edge of your sleeve, stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right? And then you're going to trim this. Trim this down just a little bit. Not cutting the knit, okay? You're just working on the silk right now. This is just a little trick that I learned. All right, I'm just going to slide this onto a seam roll and give it a little pressing. All right, use your tailor's clapper. We'll make that a nice crease. And the next thing you're going to do is turn the entire garment right side out. And when I do this, I'm going to give this one more pressing right here. All right, so now when I stitch right here, I will be enclosing that seam allowance, and then I'll stitch all the way down the seam for the top. I'll just put a couple of pins in here. I don't need to sew the whole thing with you on here, but I will sew down a little bit. So by sewing this part of the sleeve, number 1, that's a French seam, and then we're going to continue sewing all the way down with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then this part could be serged, or if your fabric doesn't fray, you'd be finished. All right, so let's go to the sewing machine. All right, I'm using a straight stitch, and I'm going to just use a 2.5 stitch length. You want to do a little back stitch at the beginning. And one tip is when you're sewing with silk chiffon, if you have any problems with your fabric getting stuck in the needle plate, there is a special needle plate that has a single hole. Use that. That's one of the best tricks for working with fabrics like this. All right, now we're at the underarm seam, so I'm just going to sew all the way down now. Now I'm using a knit, so you could use, I'm going to run this through a serger, but if you're using a knit that's really high stretch, you're going to want to use a small zigzag stitch, because what will happen is when you go to put your shirt on, it could pop your stitches. So there is my sleeve, and it's stretching fine right now. This is a very light stretch top. So let's go back up here, and we're gonna give it one more pressing, and then I'm gonna show you how to hem this. And in case I forgot to mention, the pink thread is just so you can see what's going on. So look at how dainty this fabric is. So I'm going to show you how to do a really small rolled hem on here. So let's go back to the machine. All right, I'll try to keep my hands out of the way so you can see this. I'm just going to slide the fabric under. And I'm just folding over the edge of the fabric, a really small amount, like 1/8 of an inch. If you have to go more, that's fine, because then you can trim it off if you have to. Now I'm just going to stitch, again, with a 2.5 stitch length. You want a real narrow stitch length. And what you want to focus on are what my hands are doing. Your needle is almost like your third hand. Not that you need 3 hands, but so that's holding the edge. With my thumb, I'm folding the fabric over, and I'm using this finger to control this fold, which is going to be a little different on the second path. So again, stitch, and you're going to do this all the way around the sleeve. Getting to the end, and you can see how I'm using my finger to control how much is folded over. All right. This would be the same process if you were using, say, a polyester chiffon. Any chiffon fabric would be the same. This is silk chiffon, which is really fragile. All right, so you can see here my stitch. All right, and it just barely captured that fold. So let me just get these stitches out of the way. Now, you could go press this, but I'm just going to go ahead and fold this over and stitch one more before I press. So go back here, and now I'm going to take this fabric and fold over one more time, just like that. So you can see the pink thread, fold it over, and I'm going to start at the underarm seam this time. And you're basically going to be stitching on the exact same line that you just had. This time, though, we're going to still use our needle like the third hand, and now I'm going to be folding this over with this hand, and I'm pulling the fabric this way with this hand, okay? Because you want the edge to be right on that fold. That's why I didn't press it first, just to show you how easy it is by manipulating the fabric yourself. This is just the tiniest rolled hem. This is great for bridal wear as well, if you're hemming a gown or hemming a dress like that has chiffon. Now, of course, a really fast way would be to use a rolled hem on a serger, but you always have to learn new techniques, right? All right, we're getting to the end here. All right, and let's go back to the machine, and here we go. So now you can see this up close. Here is the chiffon rolled hem. Lots of pink thread there. And I'm going to just give it a little pressing here. And give you a little close look at this French seam I was mentioning. So if you ever work with fine, like in bridal wear as well, I would say gowns, this is a little trick that you'll see in a lot of them, where you'll have a French seam at the top. I'll just slide my seam roll on here. Give this a little pressing so you can see. There we go. So there's your French seam. This part here, you could put this under the serger. You would start the serger right here and trim all the way down. So you finish the knit with the serger, you finish the silk with the French seam, and then let's take one more look at the hem here now that we've pressed it. See how beautiful that is? So dainty. So those are many different ways that you can sew the Bella top. Again, the one thing I did not do on this one was do the top stitching along the edge to keep the seam allowance in place, because you don't want that popping out right here, just like we did with the mesh. So then your last steps will be to hem your top. And when you do that on a knit, I'm just going to give you a couple tips here. And actually, I press this up before I even sew the side seams. Just give it a little pressing. A little steam. I think my iron fell asleep while I was sewing. And on around. And the only other trick is this top it curves up a little bit in the side seam, and if you have any problems while you're pressing that, you could always hem that first and then sew your side seams. That's a little trick that you might find in some ready-to-wear. So once this is pressed, you can run it through the cover stitch machine and your Bella is finished. When you look on this top here, I actually did the top stitching right here to keep the seam allowance out of the way, exactly the same way that we did with the mesh. So a simple way to do that, and of course I didn't use pink thread on this, so a lovely look. And those are many different ways that you can sew the Bella.